Warning: the following video will contain opinions related to the Star Wars franchise that may not be suitable for all audiences. Viewer discretion is advised. I know it's weird to start off like this, but better to be safe than sorry. I mean, seriously, have you seen how some Star Wars fans react to different opinions? They can be toxic as fuck.
Hey, it's not every day that I would go and talk about Star Wars, so might as well get back into what is possibly one of the biggest universes in entertainment history and talk about one of their animated shows. Specifically, I'm going to be looking into Genndy Tartakovsky's 2003 series of Star Wars Clone Wars, or technically what Disney would go and call it nowadays, the 2D micro series. I guess it's meant to go and differentiate itself from the big Clone Wars series that they do have. That's all in CG and stuff like that. You know, it's funny that when the person on Patreon requested me to go and review this show, there was a part of me that did get a little bit excited because this is actually something that is Star Wars related that I'm actually quite familiar with. In fact, I actually remember back when I was a kid, I remember watching these periodically when they would be on TV or when they would be on Cartoon Network. So having the opportunity to go and revisit this show kind of got me a little bit happy to go and I guess you could say revisit a part of my childhood that is actually Star Wars related. Which, speaking of which, before I actually go and fully talk about Star Wars Clone Wars, I just want to give you all a little bit of my background related to Star Wars to give you an idea of how this review is going to work out, or my perspective of it, so that you could go and fully understand where I'm personally coming from with my thoughts on this Star Wars Clone Wars series. I will say right now that I am not one of those die-hard Star Wars fans who would go and try to consume as much of Star Wars as possible to understand the context of everything. I am not that dedicated to know every single little factor that is within the Star Wars universe. I'm not gonna go and go as far as to read all the novels that are related to Star Wars or play all the video games, or honestly, I haven't even watched any of the CG animated films. I would honestly consider myself more of a casual Star Wars fan. And a big part of that is honestly because I actually do have family members who are major Star Wars fans, and because of that little influence, it kind of got me a little bit to know at least one step above of what's considered the basic knowledge of Star Wars. And for me, I would say that the things that I do enjoy watching from Star Wars are the main movies and also some of the shows that they would go and put out on Disney Plus, such as The Mandalorian and Obi-Wan Kenobi and a few other stuff that I'll get into later. But in terms of my thoughts on all the movies that they did put out, I would say that, well, of course, my favorites among the films are undeniably from the original trilogy. They are absolutely awesome. And I mean, they are the ones that did start this entire thing. And it's honestly very reasonable why they would go and evolve into something that's massively huge, because the original trilogy really is that good. But then you would have the recent sequel trilogy, which honestly, I wouldn't consider myself a hater. I actually did very much enjoy episode 7 and episode 8. Not a fan of episode 9 because that one just really messed things up for the sequel trilogy and kind of capped that off into something that I would say is a near disaster. I wouldn't say a total disaster. There are a few elements in there that I did enjoy, but oh boy, when it's bad, it could be oh boy. But also, I will say that one plus that the sequel does have is that it did spawn what I personally consider to be the greatest thing to ever come out of Star Wars, and that is the Rise of Resistance attraction at Disneyland and Disney's Hollywood Studios. I remember I went to a Disney World trip recently, and I got a chance to actually go into that ride twice, and oh my god, it is unbelievable. And honestly, one of the best rides that Disney has made so far. And we're talking about Disney here, so that really is saying a lot. But then you would have the prequel trilogy, or the prequel era, if you will. And that, in my opinion, is one of the lowest points in Star Wars' history, especially with episode 1 and 2. I consider them to be among the worst of the Star Wars movies. Like, they can be very, very bad. Now, I don't know if I would say it is the worst Star Wars film that I've seen, because honestly, that title, I would personally give that to the 2008 Star Wars Clone Wars movie. That one I absolutely hated because they made Star Wars boring. And honestly, one of the worst things you can ever do to Star Wars is make it boring. But with 1 and 2 though, yeah, they were pretty bad. I would say almost embarrassing how they would go from the original trilogy and then suddenly all the way down to, like, well, these. Now, granted, I will say that I actually did enjoy episode 3. Now, I wouldn't say that it's like the best Star Wars film out there, but I do enjoy the things that it would deliver, including the elements that were both intentional and unintentional at the same time, because my god, episode 3 definitely is such a goldmine for all of, or at least for some of the best memes that are related to Star Wars. But yeah, personally, I don't necessarily look too highly when it comes to the prequel era, especially when they started off on such a low point with both episode 1 and episode 2, which again, I do consider them the weakest, at least amongst the Star Wars or the Skywalker saga. So that should go and give you a little bit of my perspective and just my general opinion on the entire Star Wars franchise and how I personally feel about it. So again, I'm not necessarily a diehard fan. I just consider myself a bit more of a casual fan that does periodically like some of the main stuff that they would go and put out, even nowadays with the things that Disney would go and release. But we're not here to go and talk about anything that Disney would do nowadays or just the entire franchise in general. We are here specifically to go and talk about Genndy Tartakovsky's Star Wars Clone Wars series from 2003 to 2005. So why don't we go and actually start things off by talking about this show? So with all that said, let's get things started. So to give you all a little bit of context, in case you may not necessarily know about this series, this was supposed to be the bridge between episode 2 and episode 3. Just so that audiences can get a little bit more hyped up for what would be to come with episode 3, and that they would get a little bit of context to go and understand some of the events that have occurred between Attack of the Clones and Revenge of the Sith, so that they would get an idea about why is it that things may seem a little bit different. Like, how is it that Anakin looks different compared to how he was in episode 2, or what are some of the significant moments that did occur, and all that kind of stuff. And the reason why this was made in the first place was because George Lucas was interested in re-entering into the animation world with Star Wars. Like, there have been a few previous attempts before, but let's be honest, they were not that great. But then everything changed when he saw what Cartoon Network was doing with Samurai Jack. And he was just so mesmerized because it was exactly the kind of show that he would love Star Wars to be, something that is a lot more serious and something that definitely is a lot more action-packed. So George Lucas called Genndy Tartakovsky and the Cartoon Network team and asked, hey, do you guys want to do a Star Wars thing for me? And they said yes, and thus this is the show that we have today. We got Star Wars Clone Wars. And that would honestly be the best way that I would go and describe the 2003 Star Wars Clone Wars series, is that this is pretty much if you would go and take Samurai Jack and you would apply a Star Wars filter. And in that regard, it's very fascinating because when you do look into those two shows in particular, you could see a lot of the parallels. You could see how that approach to Samurai Jack also very much applies to this as well, especially when it comes to the tone that they would go and establish. Because with Samurai Jack, it's a series that is a lot more serious than most of the other shows on Cartoon Network. Now, that doesn't necessarily mean that it's like a full-on drama where it's never funny. Like, it doesn't hesitate to go and sprinkle in a little bit of comedy from time to time, but for the most part, it is very much action-oriented, and it mostly takes itself seriously. And the same can be said with Star Wars Clone Wars, where the emphasis is a lot more on the action. It's a lot more on the intensity and the mood of everything. While at the same time, there can be those rare occasions where, you know, it doesn't feel scared to go and make their audiences laugh with like a tiny bit of humor.
An army of droids? Here, I'd like to have a serious talk with your programmers.
Come on, 3PO.
That, and also when the action does happen, it does have a similar approach in terms of cinematography, in terms of pacing, and how they would go and present all the action that they would go and display. And not to mention that there is kind of that connection. Well, this connection is already established, that the Jedi Knights already were influenced by the samurais back in ancient times. So when you do have a samurai and then like you would go and translate that to Jedis, that's pretty much easy to do. And a lot of the action that Jack would go and find himself in, it's very much similar to the kind of action that the Jedis would go and face. And also, I just realized this right now, but then there is also the sci-fi theming as well, because when you do look at Samurai Jack, it is a bit more sci-fi oriented, and like you do see Jack suddenly finds himself in a very strange future where he would go and meet up with a whole bunch of different aliens and robots and all sorts of different creatures that he would go and interact, help, or fight, and all that kind of stuff. And then you got Star Wars as well, in which that's pretty much the entire universe. It's set in a galaxy far, far away that is filled with a massive diversity of different aliens. And that is honestly why, with all those comparisons and all those similarities that both Samurai Jack and Star Wars has, I think George Lucas picked a great team to go and actually create this Star Wars series. That Genndy Tartakovsky and the team that he had at Cartoon Network, they actually did a very solid job to translate their style of crafting shows and apply that onto Star Wars, especially when the action is honestly increasingly engaging. That the more you do watch it, the more engaging that it becomes, and the more that you become a lot more invested into seeing the action that they would keep on displaying. And not to mention that in the show itself, it has a wide variety of different action scenes. In fact, it literally does jump from like one major action sequence to another major action sequence, or there would be times when they would go and like they would focus on one and then they jump into another, and then they get updates to this one, and then they get updates to that one. But this is a series that I think it's safe to say that it is very, very action-packed. And again, a lot of the elements when it comes to the action itself, I feel like it works very, very well, including a very good fast pace to keep the intensity high and to make you like feel the need to pay attention to it more, because like there can be some times where like the fights can happen so fast where like you can blink and you'll miss something that would go and occur. So and not to mention there's also like the grand scale of it all. Even though that this is supposed to be produced for television and that, you know, this is like one of those like limited budgets, I think it is safe to say that the team at Cartoon Network, they didn't get a massive budget similar to what George Lucas would go and invest onto like the main Star Wars movies. But still though, they did manage to go and capture that scale where we do see the Jedis constantly fighting like thousands upon thousands of droids, and not to mention that there would be like a whole bunch of aircrafts that would be the size of a building. So they definitely do play with scale very well to show that, you know, this isn't just a small battle that the Jedi has to go and face. Like, you know, this is Star Wars after all. And this is like a big war that's happening that's like in the scale of like a few galaxies. So to emphasize that massive scale, I believe they actually did so pretty well with all the different clones and all the different droids that are just pitting against each other. So, and then of course, as I mentioned before, there is the cinematography where they definitely do focus in a lot of major shots and like a lot of like intricate angles that you would see the battle just continuously happening in order to get like the best moment to see, or like what would be the shots that would look the best for the Jedis when they would keep on taking down the droids, or like what would be the best shots for the villains to look absolutely menacing. So on that regard, that is also carefully crafted and help enhance the intensity of each of these moments. And with that entire combination, and with how it gets increasingly engaging the more you would go and watch it, I think it is safe to say that this is the kind of series in which you will definitely walk out with at least one favorite action scene. Like there's going to be one in which it will absolutely stand out amongst the crowd. And I would say for me, for example, one of my favorite moments in Clone Wars is actually one of the first scenes that you do see Mace Windu, where he alone, and maybe with some help from the clones as well, would have to go and try to fight off like thousands of droids, and he does so at ease. But then there's also the obstacle where there's this like skyscraper of an aircraft that would just go and create craters that it would just like press down with like this giant like lever, or just this giant hammer that just like hits down on the ground and just ends up creating this giant crater that you would probably see from space if you look at that particular planet. So seeing that action with Mace Windu, and especially with all the different shots, and especially how he proves himself to be like one of the best in terms of the Jedis, it's just so mesmerizing to go and watch. So in that regard, I would say that is one of my favorites. But the point is that for sure you will be walking out of this with at least one favorite moment or one favorite action scene from this entire series. But then of course there's also another factor that really does work out well in terms of the action, or specifically what is responsible for the action to be this good, and that is in regards to the animation, which of course is led by Genndy Tartakovsky, with Paul Reddish also joining in as the art director. And with that aspect, I think honestly it actually does work, where you have that same style that Samurai Jack had, with a little bit of some of the classic aesthetics that Cartoon Network had in some of their past shows, including Dexter's Lab and the Powerpuff Girls. And there's just something about it that actually feels like it works within the Star Wars universe. Because when it comes to Genndy Tartakovsky's more action-oriented projects such as Samurai Jack or even Primal, it feels like there's this comic book-like aesthetic, or that he took major influence from the action-packed comic books that he would go and also apply to his shows in order to go and capture that same feel, in order to capture that same kind of intensity. I would even go and say that Genndy Tartakovsky is one of those people that knows very well how to bring comic books to life, which kind of reminds me that it is very surprising that we have yet to see Genndy Tartakovsky actually work on a superhero related project, because I would feel like something like that, like if you take Genndy Tartakovsky and you make him work on something related to either like Batman or Superman, that would be like a match made in heaven. But going back into Star Wars Clone Wars, he does manage to go and capture that here as well, taking the things that he has learned about Samurai Jack, and then he and his team would go and apply that onto the Star Wars universe. And even just the look of it, there's just something about it that feels like it naturally does fit, because again, this art style was already established very well in something like Samurai Jack. So of course it would go and translate easily onto Star Wars, where you kind of have this minimalist yet also very geometric style, where it leans more into the abstract zone more so than it does in any form of realism. But there's just something about it that really does work. And again, going back into the comic book aspect, it really does feel like you're kind of seeing this Star Wars comic book suddenly coming to life, that you see all these familiar characters that you can easily go and identify them, but they do have their own unique style that is more based on shapes than they are based on the actual people, or based on like what would be considered to be the correct anatomy. And in that regard, it just really does work out in a way where the show kind of has its own artistic air to it, where now Star Wars has like this, this flat 2D style that actually works very well, and it does bring you in more into the strange universe that is Star Wars. I mean, like, it's supposed to be set in a galaxy far, far away, and the looks and the aesthetic and the anatomy of the people, some could say that it seems a bit foreign, or not really foreign, but there is something that is a little bit odd, that is something that goes beyond the realms of like what is considered to be like organic or human. And in here, it actually does work. In a way, you are watching this art piece of Star Wars that's just coming to life right before your very eyes. And even with the minimalist approach that they would do, especially when you look into the backgrounds, there's something about it that does work, where it gives you an idea of where they are. But of course, the big focus of it all is in regards to the action, is to see all the spacecrafts, all the clones, and all the droids, and all the Jedi that are fighting amongst each other. That's the thing that works out. And also another thing that I do want to go and point out is that there can be times where you do see some CG that is implemented. Mainly it happens around the first half, where you see some spacecrafts that they were all done in CG instead of everything just being in 2D or all in hand-drawn. And I would say that honestly, it does work. I mean, sure, it is noticeable that it actually is early CG, but because of the style's minimalist approach, it actually does work out well, where the simplicity of the CG does blend very well with the rest of the environment. In a way, it's pretty similar to the CG that was done in The Iron Giant, where technically it's not the most advanced computer animation that you have seen, but it did do a very good job in terms of blending with its 2D environment. And I believe that they actually did the same thing here, where the CG animation actually does fit very nicely within the realms of this version of Star Wars Clone Wars. That's actually very nice. However, one thing that I do want to point out, and this is not necessarily a criticism, but this is just like a dumb little nitpick, is that there can be times where I was a bit thrown off by some of the designs, because one thing you do have to keep in mind is that, considering that this is supposed to be based on the Star Wars prequels, many of the human characters are actually based on real people. So they're supposed to be caricatures. Like Obi-Wan Kenobi is actually a caricature of Ewan McGregor, or at least during that time. And I would say that a lot of them are fine, but there are a few instances when they can look a little bit weird, and not in the way that it works. Like, I get it. It's supposed to be Star Wars, and it's, you know, it has like an entire universe of weird looking aliens. But then you would have moments in which some of the human characters are like, the idea that it's supposed to be a caricature of this actor or actress. Honestly, there's just something about it that is unintentionally funny. Like, you would see Padme, whom is a caricature of Natalie Portman, and she has like these gigantic eyes. Or there's one little flashback where you see young Anakin with Qui-Gon Jinn, and they decided that since he was played by Liam Neeson, let's just give him this gigantic nose that's like bigger than the rest of his face. But again, this is nothing to go and really criticize the show about. It's just like little weird moments that, like, I understand you could say that it's just nitpick, but I just feel like it's something that I wanted to go and point out from my experience. Oh, and speaking of the actors, by the way, that's also one thing that I do want to mention, and that is in regards to the voice acting, which honestly, I think they actually did do a pretty good job impersonating many of the characters that we are familiar with in the movies. Now, I'm not going to say that it's an absolute great job, but I think the actors actually did do well to go and impersonate the characters. Some of my personal favorites that I would say in this, and are also considered fan favorites as well. They include James Arnold Taylor, who did an impeccable job impersonating Ewan McGregor as Obi-Wan Kenobi. Then you got the great Tom Kane playing as Yoda. Then you also have T.C. Carson, who played Mace Windu, whom honestly I thought for a second was legitimately played by Samuel L. Jackson, but no, they actually hired a really good impersonator. And then of course you also got Corey Burton playing as Count Dooku, whom I know this isn't the only time that he would go and impersonate Christopher Lee, but then again, we are talking about Corey Burton, whom honestly I consider as one of the great voice acting legends out there. And I mean, even in here, they do have some voice acting legends, like I already mentioned Tom Kane, but then you also got others like Cree Summer, Kevin Michael Richardson, and even Grey Delisle doing several different voices. But if I do have to go and give this entire show a criticism, it's actually in regards to the story, or should I say, the lack of story that is featured within here. Because the thing with this Star Wars Clone Wars is that I wouldn't necessarily say there really is a story going on. I would say that it really is just context. There's not a whole lot in terms of plot development that is actually going on. There's nothing that they really do in terms of developing the characters. I would say this entire series is 90% action, and the rest is just little moments where we do see the characters interacting with one another. In fact, I would even say any form of character development or plot development is kind of rare. Like, you do get a little bit of that at the start of season 3, or like in the last 4 chapters, where you do see some interaction and seeing a little bit of the dynamic between Obi-Wan Kenobi and Anakin, but that is pretty much it. And even at that, even if it would seem like, okay, maybe they're going to focus a bit more on the story this time, that's not really the case. It really is just action. It's just delivering one action scene after the next. And I mean, I get it. This is not necessarily something that really is worth complaining because, yeah, they're going to focus like on the war aspect, and this is Star Wars after all. So you got to make it about the wars, and you got to give people what they want to see, which is the big war that is currently going on. But still though, because its priority on the story is so low, it feels like there's not really that much of an importance, or there's not much of a purpose for this to go and exist. When you look at it in a narrative standpoint, the most that it would provide is just context that they could just go in and fill during the opening, or just throw in a few lines during Revenge of the Sith, and that's pretty much it. You don't need to watch this series in particular to go and understand what is the context of what is going on during the prequel era. And because in terms of that substance, they don't necessarily deliver a lot, that means its role in the Star Wars franchise is just not really big. I wouldn't necessarily say that this is a full-on Star Wars series. This is just a series of action scenes that would happen one after another that does have a Star Wars theme, and it has familiar characters. In terms of the plot line, it's like I said at the beginning, there is no story. All it is just a bunch of context so that you can have a little bit more of an understanding of what happened between episode 2 and episode 3. It's to answer the question of why is it that the characters in Revenge of the Sith look kind of different than they do in Attack of the Clones. But with that said though, even though that is the one criticism that I would give this series, there is also a part of it that I would say, as much as it is a curse, it is also a blessing in a way. Because one thing that you have to keep in mind is that this is a series that is based on the prequel era. This is set during the time of The Phantom Menace, Attack of the Clones, and Revenge of the Sith. And if there's one thing that the prequel era cannot do, is actually write a story. Especially in the case of episode 1 and episode 2 with The Phantom Menace and Attack of the Clones, the story and even just the writing in general with the character development and stuff like that, it absolutely sucks. So in that regard, maybe this is all just a theory here, but it feels like it's kind of like on purpose that this Clone Wars series didn't necessarily focus much on trying to develop any form of a story, or try to actually create a narrative, or really expand upon the characters of like Anakin or Obi-Wan or Padme or whatever. It is aware that the writing, like the story and the characters, are the weakest points of the prequel era. So in that regard, why even try? Why even go and try to add on to it when it could end up becoming a little bit of a detriment to the series? So instead, what the series would do is just focus on the things that actually does work with the prequel era. Focus on the elements that people really do want to see with Star Wars, especially during that time. And that is with all the action, with all the crazy things that are going on, and especially introduce any significant things that would go and happen within the series so that you would have a bit more of an understanding when that time comes, when you would go and watch Revenge of the Sith. And that is especially the case with two very significant moments. This is especially the case during season 3, or during the second half of the entire show, where we do see Anakin's first days as a Jedi, where he actually graduated from being a Padawan into a full-on Jedi. And we see how he would do, not as the assistant or the student of Obi-Wan, but as Obi-Wan's partner, as Obi-Wan's brother. So we do see the first steps of that. And not to mention, like, we even get like tiny little hints of Anakin going into the dark side. Like some of the first little moments that we do see that, yeah, there is going to be that side of Anakin in which Palpatine is going to completely exploit so that he would ultimately become Darth Vader. And of course, it needs to be mentioned, but this series is the introduction to General Grievous. And I know some people may have varying opinions on General Grievous, especially with how he was presented in episode 3, but in Star Wars Clone Wars, oh my god, this is at his prime. This is at his best. How people think of General Grievous, like when you think of him as a badass villain, that especially applies in Star Wars Clone Wars, where you see him as a major menace, seeing him as someone who could be considered on par with Count Dooku as the Republic's biggest threat. I would even say that along with that one Mace Windu scene, the moments with General Grievous, they were some of the best moments in this entire show, or at least some of my personal favorites, where you really do see him as a serious threat, or that you have legitimately met someone who does have a significant chance of completely taking down the Jedi. He really is that awesome in the show. But going back to what I was talking about before, yes, while it is a criticism that it doesn't necessarily have much story or that it has much character development, in a way, it also does work out because it focuses a lot more on the things that do work in the Star Wars prequel movies. It really does emphasize a lot more on that to go and hype fans up at the time and for it to be really enjoyable. Like, the team really did stick with what works best for this entire series. And instead of trying to experiment or add on to plot elements of the previous movies, they would go and just stick to what they want to do and stick to what they really want to see and stick to what they really want to play with, and that is with the action. So even though this is not necessarily a narrative-driven series, this is an action-driven series that in its own right actually really does work well. But overall, I'm going to be very honest, and I would say that amongst everything that came out during the prequel era of Star Wars, Genndy Tartakovsky's Star Wars Clone Wars series has to be the best of them all. I think this really is the one that really stood out among the rest as the one thing that really emphasized what people really love about Star Wars. And not only do they really emphasize a lot more on like what we really want to see in Star Wars, but it does so very, very well with some very solid animation and a lot of great action scenes. In fact, the grand majority of this whole thing is just action scenes. And even though we don't necessarily have a whole lot of character development, or that we don't necessarily have a whole lot of story elements that would go and really highlight some big moments that would happen during that era of Star Wars, for what it did its job extremely well. And I can even just look past at the flaws that it would have, and honestly, I would just happily take it for what it is, especially when the things that they don't necessarily emphasize onto the entire show, the things that they don't really touch upon, like character development or story, considering that they are some of the weakest elements of the prequel era, it's honestly understandable why they wouldn't want to go and include that and just focus on what really does work with Star Wars at the time. And that's honestly why I would say that if you are a Star Wars fan, or especially if you are a fan of Genndy Tartakovsky's more action-oriented shows such as Samurai Jack or Primal, I highly recommend that you go and check this out. And it's not necessarily that long of a watch either. In fact, the total running time of this, I calculated it's actually 2 hours and 14 minutes, which give or take is around the same length as a regular Star Wars film. So in a way, you could say that this is an animated Star Wars movie, but considering that it is a series, well, I gotta go and treat it as a series anyways. And especially, I can't really do the traditional way of reviewing it as a movie, especially like with the story, the characters, the animation, and all that kind of stuff, especially when there, well, as I said before, there are a few of those elements that they kind of lack. But still, though, it is definitely a fun watch, and it definitely is an easy watch. And if you're into, again, like either Star Wars in general, or if you're into some of Genndy Tartakovsky's more action series, then this would definitely be a very solid watch, and I would highly recommend it. And on top of that, it is actually very easy to find because now they are available on Disney Plus. You could just go and write down Star Wars Clone Wars, or just write down Clone Wars, and you'll easily find it. Again, keep in mind that they do label it as the 2D micro series, so it's specifically that one that you have to go and find. And speaking of Disney Plus, I gotta say that it's honestly kind of weird watching this series in particular on that platform, mainly because of the end of everything. Because out of every single content that you would find on Disney Plus, this Star Wars Clone Wars series is the one that ends off with this. I don't know about you, but there's just something so bizarre in seeing the Cartoon Network logo on Disney Plus, or that you would see the day that Cartoon Network would do something that would end up in the hands of Disney. And also, one thing that I do want to mention is that it is also very intriguing to see this artistic approach from an animation team working on the Star Wars project. And I felt that for the longest time, it was actually very rare to go and find. Not even the CG series would go and do something that would be like what Genndy Tartakovsky and the Cartoon Network team would go and do. That is until very recently when Disney released Star Wars Visions, which in a way is kind of like the spiritual successor of Genndy Tartakovsky's Star Wars Clone Wars series, where you do have several different Star Wars stories going on, but each of those animated shorts that were released, they would be given to a different animation studio. And these are animation studios from all around the world. You got the first volume, in which they were given to a variety of Japanese animation studios so that you would have a collection of Star Wars anime. And then you would have volume 2, in which that one I highly admire, and I would even say is possibly the most underrated Star Wars content that has come out, at least during the Disney era, because that's where you would get Star Wars stories from a variety of animation studios from all over the world, some of which are highly beloved, including Aardman, Cartoon Saloon, Triggerfish, La Cachette, and many, many more. So that's also another recommendation that I want to go and do as well, that for those of you who are familiar with Tartakovsky's Star Wars Clone Wars, if you enjoyed that show, then I recommend to also go and watch Star Wars Visions as well. And the best part about it is that with Star Wars Visions, you don't necessarily need massive context of what's going on within the Star Wars universe. You don't need to go and watch a whole bunch of things to go and understand what is currently happening with like those animated shorts right there. You know, it's not like the current format of what's happening with the recent Star Wars shows, including The Mandalorian, where honestly, it feels like Dave Filoni is kind of hijacking the entire franchise, where he's kind of gatekeeping it to make it be catered exclusively to the Clone Wars fans, so that he would go and push in elements from his shows that he has done to go and like give special little treats to fans, which for a casual fan like myself who hasn't watched anything from the CG Clone Wars series, I kind of feel honestly left out, where they're trying to make big deals out of things that honestly I just don't necessarily comprehend. And again, I just ultimately feel left out of all this because I'm not that much of a diehard Star Wars fan to go and fully understand some of those contexts. But anyways, that's just a little side rant that I just wanted to comment on, like, the current format of Star Wars. And not to say that I'm completely against what Dave Filoni is doing. I'm not saying that like he's a bad filmmaker or anything like that. I just feel like with his approach, it feels like he's just catering to niche Star Wars fans more so than like a casual Star Wars fan like myself. But let's go back to talking about Genndy Tartakovsky's Star Wars Clone Wars. And if I gotta give that show a rating, honestly, I'm gonna give this an 8 out of 10. Now, I know I said that it is the best thing to come out of the Star Wars prequel era, but that doesn't necessarily mean that it's the best thing that ever came out of Star Wars ever, especially when it does lack story and it does lack a bit of character development. But then again, it's a show where what it does right, it does so beautifully. And it's honestly the kind of show that you could just go and watch again and again just to be invested in all the crazy action that they would go and do, no matter how many times that you would see it, including myself. I think this is like, what, my 4th or 5th time that I've watched this show. And like, even for the sake of watching this review, I still get invested. I still have a lot of fun seeing all the creative action that they would go and supply. So again, highly recommended, definitely an awesome show. And again, I still stand that it's the best thing to come out during the prequel era of Star Wars. And with that said and done, that should be it for my review of Genndy Tartakovsky's Star Wars Clone Wars. So with all that said, I want to say thank you all so much for watching, and also especially thank you to Alan Oliva for his amazing support on Patreon, which allowed him to get this review of Star Wars Clone Wars. So I just want to go and quickly mention that if you would like to be like Alan and you want to go and get some amazing rewards, including this one, and also watching my videos before anyone else, then all you have to do is go to patreon.com/animat. But at the same time, if you did enjoy this review, don't forget to go and give this a like and to go and subscribe to my YouTube channel. Yes, I would go and do a whole bunch of different reviews in the animation world, not just with Star Wars, but especially with animated films, and also different kinds of content that is related to animation. So if you enjoyed this one, then don't forget to subscribe so you won't miss more of my wacky antics related to animation. So with all that said and done, I would like to say thank you all so much for watching, and until next time, see you later, dudes.
Master Yoda, I am convinced. I will not require my captain's further persuasion.